Thank you. I'm Dr. Christie, I'm a psychologist here at Heartland, and I'm very pleased to that you guys could all come, everybody come here to the meeting today of our ethics committee, and we're really looking forward to a presentation from our speakers. Let me introduce them. Mario Dwyer will be one of the speakers here, and Attorney Dwyer, let me review her educational history. She received an undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago in the bachelor's degree in a study of the history, philosophy, and social studies of medicine and science. She continued her education. She had a fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation in the Center of Ethics and Humanities and Spiritual Care. She had an internship at Resurrection Healthcare System at the Resurrection Healthcare System Department of Clinical Ethics, which is in Chicago. Her graduate education includes a master's degree in bioethics from the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine in the Department of Bioethics. And additionally, she is a graduate of the St. Louis University Law School and received her Juris Doctorate degree. Her professional experience includes the position of assistant professor at the Northeast Ohio Medical University. She was an adjunct professor at the Family Medicine Institute at Institution in Georgetown. She was a clinical ethicist at MedStar in Washington Hospital Center. She served as an assistant professor of family medicine at Institution at Georgetown. Her current positions are a scientist reviewer at the Institute Health Group, SRA International in Fairfax, Virginia. She is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Bioethics at Case Western Reserve University, and she is a clinical ethicist at university hospitals. And throughout her career, she's won a number of awards and honors. She's a member of a number of professional societies, and I won't go into detail. She has invited lectures, and the title of this, the first one struck me. It says, the title is, "Your Recovery is Not My Recovery." Testing a shared decision-making model. Something we all face on a day-to-day basis, so that really I thought was quite appropriate for our setting here. Also, among the publications and presentations is a presentation on emergency medicine and psychiatry, providing care to involuntarily committed patients. Again, something that could not be more relevant to the work that we do. I think the overwhelming majority of our patients, of course, are involuntarily committed, either forensically or civilly. And another presentation focused on the role of mental illness in the development of patient care. So very direct applications to the type of work that we do. So we're really quite pleased to have Attorney Dwyer available today to make a presentation. And then Dr. Robert Michael O'Gurin is with us today also. Dr. Gurin's education includes a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Duquesne University. As I mentioned to him, that rings a bell from my distant past. Let's just leave it at that. I will say this, my experience with a bachelor's degree in philosophy does not make you extraordinarily desirable in the job market. Things have changed, that's my personal experience.
Things have not changed. and since you were a bachelor, since you graduated with a bachelor in philosophy, it's still a brutal job market.
Dr. Cruzen received a doctorate degree in philosophy from the University of Kentucky. He spent a year at the University of Munich. He did a fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic in advanced bioethics, and he currently continues his education at the Cleveland Psychoanalytic Center to achieve his certification in psychoanalysis. His professional appointments have included teaching assistantship at the University of Kentucky. He was an adjunct professor in bioethics department of the Case Reserve Medical School. He was a bioethics fellow at the Cleveland Clinic for a 2-year period. He was an adjunct instructor at Harvard in the fall of 2017, and he also is currently a clinical ethicist at the University Hospitals in Cleveland. And Dr. Gruen has received many awards and grants, most recently the Cleveland Clinic Education Foundation Excellence in Teaching Award, and publications, a number of publications, including most recently the Will Reconsidered Hard Choices in Living Organ Donations. He has made many presentations, invited presentations, and peer-reviewed presentations. Again, I won't go into detail about those, but his teaching experience is, as I mentioned, both at the University of Kentucky, Cleveland Clinic, Harvard, and currently Case Western Reserve University. So we're very happy to have these presenters help us as the ethics community here at the hospital. When I spoke with Attorney Dwyer about this presentation, I asked if they could focus on the basic fundamentals. What is a reasonable expectation for an ethics committee? What should we be doing to promote the committee's services, and maybe a framework or analysis that we can each of us develop as we proceed to address very, very serious ethical decisions that will come to us. So without taking any more of your time, welcome, and thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Christie, for that really warm welcome, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Again, my name is Robert Guerin, and I'm going to start the presentation by focusing on this first piece, history. There's a lot we're going to talk about. As I mentioned to Dr. Christie earlier, I'm not so sure that we'll be able to get through all of our slides, but that's okay. We'd like to leave you with these slides, and we're always available for further contact if you have any questions or concerns. But the title again is Ethics Committee's History, Composition, Function, and Prerequisite Knowledge. So without further ado, let me just open up with a case which may ring a bell for all of you. Right? There's nothing wrong with me. Why have you kept me here for the last week? I do not understand how I ended up here when all I came here to do was to visit my mother. You're all keeping me here because I did not want that nurse feeding my mother dirty, filthy food. A comment from an involuntarily committed patient being held and treated against her wishes. Open up with that illustration, and we'll return to cases toward the end, okay, to understand a little bit more about the ethical complexities of cases like these. Okay, so here's what we want to do. We're going to review the history of ethics committees. I am an historian of philosophy, and so I like to always know my roots, why we're even here. Review the composition of an ethics committee. Again, we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts as Dr. Christie requested. The function of an ethics committee. What are you doing as an ad hoc membership? And then we're going to review a little bit of principalism, okay, in professional patient relations. I'm going to focus a little bit on the concept of autonomy, again, in respect to mental health, as well as confidentiality, which is such a big issue in mental health care. Okay? And then hopefully we'll have time to discuss a few case reports and we can think through the ethical issues together from what we've learned. Okay, so just a little bit of background. Today, there's an ethics committee in almost every single mental health institution, almost every single hospital. But they were virtually non-existent in the 60s and 70s. Okay? As recently as the 1980s, ethics committee presence had expanded to over 60% of US hospitals. And by the late 1990s, ethics committees were present in over 90%. So the question is, what accounts for this explosive growth in the late 20th century? Okay? The God Committee. Has anyone ever heard of this committee? All right. In the 1960s, Belding Scribner at a Swedish hospital in Seattle made possible dialysis by creating a permanent indwelling shunt with a shutoff valve that allowed for repeated dialyzing through the same sites. Scribner convinced hospital administrators to establish 17 outpatient dialysis slots at a long-term artificial kidney center. The success of Scribner Center created a scarcity problem. There were far too many patients and not enough machines. So the following ethical question arose. How should candidates for dialysis be chosen? This is a scarcity issue, which is not just which we can extrapolate to even institutions like these, right? You only have so many beds, right? So how do you choose which patients to prioritize over others? Right? You may say, well, let's take the sickest first. But there may also be other considerations which you might take into account when choosing. An admissions and policy committee, really the first type of ethics committee of its kind, developed criteria based on candidates' age, sex, occupation, marital status, education, dependence, income and net worth, past performances and future potential, and references. Right? Who's going to get a dialysis machine? Right? How do we choose who is going to basically live and who's going to die? If you've ever been involved in organ transplantation through friend or relative, and you may be familiar with some of the criteria, right? And you may know that we don't choose candidates on the basis of marital status, right? We don't say, oh, this person's not married, so he or she goes to the back of the line. Right? We don't choose people on the basis of income and net worth. Right? But this was the first committee of its kind that was asking questions like, how do we choose some people over others? The questions being asked were, what are the relevant ethical considerations? Right? So, what did this reflect? The committee in Seattle foreshadowed the function of ethics committees because right, technology creates options that formerly seem unthinkable. Value-laden options go well beyond what medical science can address. A pluralistic context produces situations in which all stakeholders do not share the same values, and decisions need to be made in a relatively short time. Right? Now, here are a few seminal cases that, again, are part of the history of these committees. Karen Quinlan, you may have heard of her. On April 15th of 1975, a 21-year-old Karen Quinlan was found unconscious and non-responsive by friends not long after they helped her to bed. She suffered from a drug overdose, was transported to the hospital, placed on a respirator and fed through a nasogastric tube. After months in a vegetative state, her parents requested the removal of the respirator. Her physicians and hospital administrators refused, saying that it would be euthanasia, murder, in their eyes. Appealing to the constitutional right to privacy, the New Jersey Supreme Court supported the Quinlan's right to have the respirator withdrawn. The New Jersey Supreme Court, fearing that a torrent of similar cases would grind the judicial system to a halt, suggested that ethics committees, physicians really, they thought, for prognostic purposes, might play an active advisory role in such cases instead of the courts. I don't know if you've thought, how many cases could we possibly bring to the judicial system? And if we brought every single case, what it perhaps just overloads courts. One of the functions of an ethics committee is so that the courts aren't hearing cases day to day, because you're the experts, especially in regard to mental health. Right? The judges, for the most part, recognize that they don't understand the medicine, they don't understand the physiology, and so they want to rely on ethics committees such as this one to be making ethical decisions for patients. Another instance of the rise of ethics committees. In the early 80s, there was a divide between pro-life and pro-choice views after Roe v. Wade, extending the debate around withholding and withdrawing treatment for several severely impaired newborns, resulting in the baby Doe regulations. These regulations require aggressive care for newborns unless such cases, they said, would merely prolong dying, not be effective in ameliorating or correcting all the infant's life-threatening conditions, or otherwise be futile in terms of the survival of the infant. By the end of '84, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Hospital Association issued statements supporting the use of interdisciplinary ethics committees as an alternative to government investigation in such cases. Okay. Again, trying to alleviate the burdens of the federal government and the judiciary system. That same year, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research endorsed the establishment and use of ethics committees. 2 years later, the American Medical Association Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs supported ethics committees as a way of addressing ethical issues that emerge in clinical settings. One function that we'll talk about today is the clinical ethical support that a committee provides to an institution. Finally, Nancy Cruzan. She was a 24-year-old who had been injured in a car accident. In '83, and she remained in a permanent vegetative state for 7 years. Unlike Quinlan, Cruzan was only kept alive by a feeding tube. Her parents requested that a feeding tube be withdrawn and she be allowed to die on the grounds that Nancy would not have wanted it. Opposed by the state of Missouri, right, the state said that there must be clear and convincing evidence and argued that the parents only offered vague recollections of their daughter's wishes. The Supreme Court recognized that competent patients have a constitutional liberty interest, a liberty-based right to be free from unwanted medical interventions. I'll refer later to what we'll talk about as unwanted medications in light of certain advanced directives, right, in mental health care. It's based on this constitutional liberty interest. Okay, so what happened? The Patient Self-Determination Act of 1991 underscored patients' rights to direct their care by mandating that patients be informed of such rights and offer information about advanced directives. Do you see a lot of patients arise in this institution with advanced directives? Do they come in with them? No? That's a real shame. I mean, do you offer patients the opportunity to create advanced directives once they have, you think, the capacity to do so? Yes. Do many patients accept the offer and fill them out, or do many refuse? They refuse.
Are you differentiating between medical and psychiatric advanced directives?
Well, so which one do you offer? Because the psychiatric advanced directives are really wonderful. I mean, they say things like ECT, they have various medications that you would accept, medications you wouldn't accept. So they're much more detailed than the one that just says, if I'm in a permanent vegetative state, I don't want artificial nutrition hydration. So do you have a particular psychiatric advanced directive which you offer patients?
We do. The patient rights advocate does, and I've completed those with patients, but it's been very rare that they've shown an interest in that.
Okay. In 1992, just to conclude this historical piece of this presentation, the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, JCAHO, changed its recommendation stating that hospitals have some mechanism for dealing with ethical issues in clinical care to a requirement. Okay? So each hospital which has accreditation from the healthcare organization, the Joint Commission, must have some mechanism. And this mechanism is usually at the bare minimum in ethics committee. If there's more institutional support and resources, it's not just a committee, but you might have a clinical ethicist like me and Mary. So, lessons learned. The God Committee, Quinlan, Doe Regs, Cruzan, all of these feature technological developments, value-laden questions, clashes between values in a pluralistic context, and relative time pressure for decision-making. These features arguably characterize the need that ethics committees were designed to address. All right, so that being said, let's talk a little bit about the composition and function of the committee.
Can I ask you one question?
Yeah.
What exactly do you mean by a pluralistic context?
So what I mean by a pluralistic context is that there are members of our community who have different beliefs or value systems, right? So the bread and butter of what we do is primarily end-of-life decision-making. So there are some people there are some patients and families that we speak with who say, life for life's sake is valuable. I cannot consent to the removal of the respirator from my loved one because my loved one believes that life is intrinsically valuable and that life is better than no life. We might speak with another family who says, right, this is not a quality of life. Right? And so I don't believe that life for life's sake is valuable. I believe that life with specific conditions, right, is worth living. Right? And we don't say to one family or the other, your belief is wrong and your belief is right. Right? Given our pluralistic context of values, we say, right, this is a respectable opinion and this is a respectable opinion. Right? Just like with mental health, some people might say, I find a life with some mania valuable. Right? Some people might say, you know what? when I'm a little manic, it feels good. Right? Other people might say, no, I'm not comfortable with this. It's ruined my relationships, right? I've lost all my money, right? I've lost my home, right? So one person to another might say, you know what? A little bit of mania might not be such a bad thing for you if you can function relatively well and you find it valuable. But you might have another patient who says, I'm going to keep taking my lithium because I don't want this to happen to me again.
And some of us may value just a little bit of mania. We should touch.
All right, so I just want to ask, just by a show of hands, how many of you guys have ever served on an ethics committee before this committee?
Look at Bob over there. Super ethical.
I'm not on this one, but.
You're not on this one, but you've previously served, okay. So can I just ask you guys then, from your experience, what are some of the things that the committees that you served on before, what did they deal with? What did they address?
It was more based policy type stuff,
Mhm.
policies for patient care,
Right.
policies for the hospital. That was some of the gist of things that we talked about in the past.
Okay. And what about you? What was your experience
It was primarily policy as well.
as well? Okay. So that is completely correct. But just kind of taking a step back from the actual work, but let's talk about the actual composition of these committees. So when you were on these committees, I'm sure there was more than one person on there, and they had different backgrounds and different purposes throughout the hospital. Now, the regulation that requires for all hospitals to have an ethics committee, they just say there has to be an apparatus, some type of mechanism to deal with these ethical issues, but they don't say exactly how that should be composed. But in general, most ethics committees are very pluralistic in the type of team members that are involved in making decisions and creating policies for the institution. So actually, this is from your own ethics committee policy here at your institution. That the committee shall be composed of a psychologist and physician/psychiatrist as appointed by the medical director. Recovery and rights advocate, which I believe one or two of you guys are actually here. Representatives from nursing, social work, HR, fiscal, and we didn't know what MIS was.
IT, information technology.
Okay, all right. As well as community members, patients, peer support specialists, as indicated. The chairperson shall be appointed by the medical director. So, do you guys have all of these components right now on the committee?
We have most, where it says as well as, I think we're lacking, I know we're lacking. We've talked about including peer support, we've not done that yet. And we've also talked about someone maybe from a faith community or faith tradition,
Yes,
and we haven't done that yet.
okay.
But that kind of, those are a couple of additions that we feel might improve the quality of our committee and our function.
Right, right. So, I've had experience with many different types of ethics committees, and they pretty much have a similar composition to what you guys have here included in your policy. I thought it was interesting though that the policy doesn't mention legal. There's also been a lot of debate of whether or not to include legal in these committees, not only because because the committee deals with hospital policy, and you want to make sure that it's in line with the laws that may be at play with those individual policies, but there are certain situations that people often question, what is ethical is not necessarily what is legal, and what's legal isn't necessarily what is ethical. And so do we really want legal to be at the table to discuss ethics cases, ethics policies? So that's something else that sometimes comes up.
I'll just add that when making policy, of course, it's like making sausage, and it has to go through the legal department to make sure that it is legally compliant. And that can be very helpful then to have someone represented from your legal department. But the legal departments, in my experience, are also very protective of the institution.
Right.
And ethics committees can sometimes challenge the institution and make recommendations which aren't aligned with the interests of the institution. And so it can lead to great debate in your ethics committee, but you also want to be careful that your committee isn't sort of a guard dog of the institution, that it is something which challenges the institution and says, you know what, this is ethically impermissible, and I know it's going to cost us money, but it's not the right thing to do, right? Or the right thing to do is going to cost us more money.
What would you guys suggest in that? Technically we have, we have a lawyer on the committee. I'm a lawyer. But I don't know that I feel comfortable functioning as a lawyer with respect to my role on the committee,
Right.
Because I'm a psychologist.
Right.
So would you suggest?
So we're in the same boat. I'm a lawyer too by training, but my function on the committee is not as legal. And so that is very clear. I take off my legal hat, put on my ethics hat. Now, I will give caveats at certain times when people do get concerned about the legal implications of things and, kind of demarcate where some of the issues may arise so that if they truly do need to speak to legal, I'll make that very clear for the committee or even for individuals who contact the Ethics Consultation Service. We also have I would say they're full members of our ethics committee, but we do have two of our lawyers who we do try to regularly contact whenever there is an issue that does involve them that they should be aware of. And they are invited to our ethics committee on an ad hoc basis, but they are not regular attending members to our committee because of those exact conflicts that, they're more concerned with the legal liability to the hospital versus what's really ethically appropriate given the situation that we're dealing with. Just to give you an example, we actually were dealing with a case of a patient who was undocumented. And so sometimes we get the question of, well, should we be calling immigration on them? This patient also needs ongoing outpatient care. And there was a question of, well, do we have an ethical obligation to continue providing care to them until discharge? Knowing that this patient is uninsured, likely will never be able to be placed in any type of nursing facility, and also, the cost of his care. But keep in mind, the care that he would need would extend his life several years. And if we had brought that to legal, I think that we would have very different conclusions than if it was just from an ethics perspective. But these are things that you need to consider when you're thinking about the composition of your committee. But I do want to really focus on the community members because they are very, very helpful. All right, so what is the value of a community member? So one of the concerns that, that often comes up is that when we have community members, they bring that outside perspective that, that isn't always available to regular ethics committee members because you guys are employees of the hospital. So there's always a concern that, you guys are working within a bubble. You really do need this outside perspective that can help help the discussion and how things should actually work themselves out. So the value of these community members are really as a kind of corrective situation, and it should be used in order to prevent the committee from being kind of insulated to only thinking about how the institution would be impacted by the determinations of the committee. Okay. In UH's ethics committee, we actually have, I think we have more community members than we have hospital employee ethics committee members. They are extremely useful because we use them for our patients without proxies subcommittee. So patients who come in who lack capacity and we cannot find any family members, they don't have a surrogate, they don't have next of kin, and they don't have a guardian or appointed power of attorney. And so we use them, our community members, to stand in as family for these patients to make medical decisions on their behalf. Because again, in Cuyahoga County, the probate court has recognized we don't want these cases. If we could literally spend all of our time just dealing with these cases, so we'd rather you, the ethics committee, deal with it. So we've actually gotten authority from our probate court to make these decisions on patients' behalves. And another basis for doing this is not only because they don't want it to tie up the court system, but also they recognize the value of having the community make this decision versus the hospital institution make that decision, because there are conflicts of interest that arise with that. And we avoid those conflicts of interest by having our community members make those decisions. Okay? All right. So again, they are a safeguard against insularity and institutional protection. They also do bring a diverse set of expertise and knowledge. So I think that, for a lot of institutions we have in our committee members, that they tend to have the same type of backgrounds, and so having community members, they do bring a different type of background than we would normally be exposed to. So for our community members, we have had a violin teacher, we've had a retired teacher, we've had, a priest that's joined us before. We've also had a law professor, a researcher, but we try our best to represent the wider community as much as possible. It's not always the easiest thing because, it's really people volunteering their time, but as much as possible, we try to have them involved. And like I said, we use them for our institution for surrogate decision-making for patients without proxies. Okay. Now let's actually turn to the role, the actual functions of an ethics committee.
Are there any questions about community members or how to even recruit them if you're having trouble? We usually sort of pick for retirees. It's usually the easiest way to do it if you know people who are retired and looking for to spend time at the hospital.
Or even sometimes family members of patients who are really grateful that of the care that was provided to their loved ones.
Attorneys, in particular, I know Dr. Ahmed would agree with me that you can never have enough attorneys. Are you talking about someone who specializes in healthcare or just having an attorney?
Just having an attorney, yeah. But again, you would have to emphasize to them their role not as an attorney, their role as a committee member. Yeah. I know that recruiting community members, like Dr. Guerin was saying, can sometimes be difficult, but again, I don't know if you guys have a volunteer office. We sometimes ask our volunteer office if they have anyone who's willing, because you guys don't meet necessarily on a regular basis. Sometimes it's only 1 hour a month, and so people really find that to be a manageable amount of time. I think also, yes, we look at retirees, but also just, again, family members of former patients, they also tend to want to join our committee. Like our pediatric committee, we have a number of parents of former patients who are on the committee.
It's a lot of, it's a lot of responsibility for somebody to make those medical decisions, and I guess it's a lot of sort of implicit trust, that community member, you're just assuming that they're going to work in the person's best interest, and obviously they're on the committee and they're invested in that, but I'm not articulating this very well. If you had an attorney, it seems like who was doing that in the way that an attorney acts as a guardian, they have a a broad spectrum of ideas about the person's rights and everything. And,
Right.
do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, I do see what you're saying. So in order to kind of, I don't know if it's provide safeguards, but we don't usually make decisions just with one community member. It's usually with, we share that responsibility. Because I do know, and the feedback that we've got from our community members is that they recognize there's a certain weight to making decisions for patients.
Sure.
And oftentimes, they're making literal life and death decisions, you know, talking about withdrawing a ventilator. So, yeah, they don't want the whole responsibility, but they recognize the full implications of what they're choosing to do on behalf of a patient. I think if we had a community member who was, you know, definitely thinking about all the ramifications, the patient's rights, things like that, we actually find it to be very useful. And we encourage them to ask questions around those issues during the discussions, because the way these meetings usually work is that we have our community members meet with not only the ethics consultant that's already involved with the case, but also the medical team. And their job is to ask all the questions that they feel are relevant to that patient's care, talking about the risks and benefits of the treatments that are being proposed, thinking about all the alternatives, how much did we actually try to find family to act on behalf of this patient, making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed before we move forward with making certain decisions for patients. So we definitely encourage that.
How do you screen out the crazy? Sorry, there were a lot of ways I could have asked that, but that seemed like the simplest.
Well, I think that, one way is just to remember that I think Dr. Christie had mentioned shared decision-making. This isn't, you're not going to pick up the phone and say, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, we have a patient, here's the situation, what decision would you like to make? We'd like you to come in, we'd like to talk to our clinicians, we'd like to have a group discussion at the table, and if someone voices a particular opinion that seems far out, everyone's involved, and everyone has an equal share of the decision-making. Right? So I think that's one safeguard, that you're not picking up the phone and asking your community member, this is your decision, A or B.
Yeah, we have 10 seconds to make it.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, but also they probably wouldn't make it to our committee. They have far out ideas that don't seem to.
What's the process for that? Is
Well,
there an interview, or how does that work?
so they have to go through the regular volunteer process through
Okay,
our
okay.
hospital, and they have to, you really have to want to do this. So you have to get your immunizations, you have to bring that. You also need to get references. They do a background check as well. So
Like a criminal background
a
check?
criminal background check, yes. So yes, they definitely weed out the crazy.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? No? Okay, now on to the role of the committee. All right. So yes, there are three basic roles of the committee. So just like you guys were saying before, policy is definitely up there. That is a huge role of an ethics committee. We also provide a lot of education to ourselves as committee members, as well as to the institutions that we're serving, and by the way, to other institutions outside of our own system. We also provide ethics consultation, but that's unique no, it's not unique, but it's available for every committee. I know that it depends on how comfortable the committee is with handling consults, but it does occasionally happen. For our institution, because we have full-time ethics consultants, our committee doesn't usually deal with cases, but we do review certain cases with them. They do, though, get involved in cases where we are withdrawing treatment against family wishes. So that is a one-time, and it is very rare. I think that we've only done that once, when we've withdrawn treatment against family wishes. So, yeah. Yes.
I serve on the Board of Developmental Disabilities in the county where I live, and having been on the ethics committee there for a number of years, one of the functions there is sort of like a consultation, whereas they would review for conflict of interest. If a family is reimbursed for something that they utilized or needed for their loved one who receives services from DD, and perhaps they have someone who also works, on the board or works for the board. There's things like that that they sort out to determine whether or not it's ethical.
Right.
There's a conflict of interest. So that's type consultation that
Yes.
they
that they do.
provide.
Okay. Yeah. Just thinking about what you said, and I just quickly reviewing some of the other cases that we've brought to our committee. We've also discussed genetic cases where it's, of course, implications for multiple family members within one family that we brought it to the full committee. We've also brought consults from our institutional review board about human subject research for specific projects that the IRB has asked for us to specifically review. So there's a whole variety of consults that can be brought to the ethics committee. Later on in the talk, we will also get into some of the different type of policies that will be relevant to this committee that you guys may want to consider developing for your institution. Okay. All right. So, ethics education. I know Dr. Guerin always is prompting us to do more education at our ethics committee meetings. I definitely want to encourage you guys to consider doing that too, because a big part of doing what you do is providing yourself knowledge about how to deal with the cases that you'll be seeing in the institution or the issues that will be coming up as well. We also want to think about providing education to staff and to the healthcare professionals, because they're the ones that are on the ground seeing what's actually happening. And sometimes, they'll have that kind of thought in the back of their mind about, this doesn't exactly feel right to me. Maybe this is something that I want to further think about or talk to someone about. And so in that way, you guys can be a further resource to the professionals and other staff. And especially in providing education to them about how to think through certain situations and issues that come up. Also community outreach as well, because a lot of the decisions that you make will have community implications as well. And so you do want to make sure that people understand kind of the thought process behind certain decisions that are made as well. So a study in 1999 indicated that ethics committees spend the highest percentage of their time on self-education. This is how important it is. This should not surprise us, given that education appears to be a prerequisite for policy formation and review and ethics consultation. We always want to ground any recommendations and policies that we're developing in known and evaluated research that we know is effective for the issues that we see. Okay?
Now, in light of your specific policy in your ethics committee, you're an ad hoc committee, so you're meeting only when ethical issues arise. So the challenge then is, how do you incorporate education if you're solely an ad hoc committee? It might require revising your bylaws or the policy itself to say, maybe as an institution, as a committee, you think a monthly meeting is excessive, right? But maybe it should be quarterly. And that gives you an opportunity, if there are no cases that have arisen, there may be no institutional needs, but nonetheless, it gives you an opportunity to look at the literature, keep yourself up to date, what is happening with respect to new guidelines by various associations, or just literature, bioethicists publishing things in mental health ethics.
One other thing to consider too, if you do have a case that comes up, sending out, along with the notification that there needs to be a meeting to discuss a specific case or issue, sending literature along the way as well to kind of prep people for the discussion that's going to take place. That's also something that's very helpful to kind of generate the discussion that's going to take place when you actually meet to discuss the consult. So I'm going to list here a couple of areas of education that you guys can consider taking a look at. So the big one, informed consent and refusal. I'm sure that comes up a lot. So one of the issues that we often have to consider is mild coercion ethically permissible in mental health care?
Yes, I run a whole unit that way. Mild is a nice way of putting it.
Exactly, but there are lots of issues to unpack within that. And that actually touches upon one of the cases that we're going to talk about. I agree, mild is a very nice way to put things.
When we get into questions situations where that we asked, we need to restrain someone, but how do you do it? What's the least invasive way in which to do this? Or questions about how long are you going to do this? If someone's in an acute situation, frequently what we see in the hospital is we have someone who is refusing, say, a blood product, and the refusal might be grounded in a lack of understanding or appreciation because of a particular mental health disorder. And so how long will it take to treat the disorder if that's possible, such that we can treat the acute situation? But if we can't do that, how long are we going to do this? Or how long are we going to restrain someone? So we run into these more difficult questions when we think about coercion, like what is it going to be like and for how long?
Right, and it's not only, for what type and how long are we going to use the restraints, but also what type and how long are the treatments that we're going to have to provide with the assistance of the restraints. So this comes up, I think, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. We have a patient who has mental health issues along with cancer. It always seems to be that combination for some reason. And so we have to look specifically, okay, is this a type of cancer where we're talking about 1 or 2 treatments of radiation, or 1 round of surgery and then just a little bit of chemo? Or are we talking about chemotherapy for several years that the patient will have to be bringing themselves or having someone bring them continuously, and we have to restrain them every single time they come in? So we start looking at what are the full implications of actually providing treatment in that situation. And in those cases, is it ethically permissible to continuously do this every single time we have to provide treatment? So yes, these are huge things that we have to take a look at and definitely come into play when you think about informed consent and refusal. Next is decisional capacity. This comes up so often that our own inpatient psych team has now refused to do capacity assessments. They actually have it like a chart note that walks everyone through the steps of doing capacity assessments. Does that come up often here, of having to do capacity assessments?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah,
So we
that's
have
what I
a
figured.
process in place.
Right, right. But a lot of physicians are uncomfortable with doing it, especially ones that don't often see patients with mental health issues. And so, it comes up constantly to the point that they've actually asked me as a lawyer and Dr. Guerin as a PhD in philosophy to do the capacity assessments because they just feel so uncomfortable with doing it. So we look at what tools are available to assess patient capacity, which you guys are very familiar with. And does the personality disorder undermine capacity to refuse treatment? What do you guys think about that?
For their rights, they have the right to refuse treatment for ORC. I mean, we may not agree with it. It may not be in their best interest, but
Rational versus irrational is a good bar. Personality disordered folks, I think, tend to be rational even if the behavior is self-sabotaging, whereas, you can identify bizarre ideas or irrational ideas more clearly from a psychotic person. I think that's a big difference.
Right. Another one that tends to come up for us too is how much does substance abuse play a role in whether or not someone is capacitated? Like if their addiction is so strong that it is overwhelming their ability to make rational decisions for themselves, can we then override their capacity to make an informed refusal of treatment? And so that's something that we often deal with and struggle with. So again, I don't know how much substance abuse you guys have to deal with here, but I figure it's something that you guys have to deal with as well.
Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say discharge, I think, is an issue for folks who have substance use disorders because you know that there may be an underlying motivation to get back out into the community to use,
Right.
even if that's not something they're verbalizing, so certainly something to keep in mind, but you can't force substance use treatment, so.
You can see these topics as, this is just the tip of the iceberg here. And the questions, the sub points that are questions are just examples. And what you could see this as, these could be topics for each quarterly meeting that you have, right? You're going to say, look, let's meet in this month, and the topic of the conversation for our separate education is going to be decisional capacity. And in my cursory glance at the literature, as I was just thinking of various topics as examples, there's a lot of literature on personality disorders and decisional capacity. And by bioethicists who are thinking about when someone presents with a personality disorder who is able to reason, is able to understand, is able to show appreciation, but nonetheless is behaving in ways that appear self-undermining from a third-person perspective. The question is, should we be coercing this patient to take medications against the patient's autonomous refusal? So these are just examples, but if you do a little bit of a literature review, you would see, wow, there's actually some bioethicists who are thinking about this, and maybe that would be a good topic of conversation for our upcoming meeting. Distribute the literature, have a conversation about it, and it might help you in your practice then going forward. Because you may feel like, I'm really uncomfortable about this, but hey, the ORC says this person can refuse, so fine, right? But you still have that gut feeling of this doesn't seem right.
And I want to jump down to this last one listed here, withholding, withdrawing, life-sustaining treatment. I don't think that this is something that often comes up here, but in our context, this sometimes comes up when we're talking or dealing with a patient with end-stage anorexia nervosa. So this tends to be something that's really hard to sort out. Okay. All right, now let's turn to policies.
Could I interrupt you before you go on in just a practical matter? We've gone about the first hour. I thought maybe we could have a break at some time,
Okay.
or, if people want to just proceed ahead, absent a break and just leave or come back, whatever your preference would be, for break or no break or.
Sure.
I don't think we need a break.
No.
Michael, we're tough.
Okay, very good.
Hang in there.
I guess also, some of us have to leave at 10 for a patient conference, so I guess we'd like to get in as much as we can before that.
Yes.
If it's okay with you, that's great.
Yeah. Okay. So, like education, policies reflect the institution's nature. Now, policies can cover a wide variety of topics, but I wanted to focus on these big three because I think these are the ones that are most relevant to your group. So looking at informed consent and surrogate decision-making, that is a huge one. Do you guys often deal with surrogates and decision-making here?
Yeah, absolutely. We're calling, so guardians, we call all the time, had to do it yesterday.
Right. So one of the things that often comes up for us is that, well, I shouldn't say often, sometimes comes up for us is that you'll have a guardian and we have fully, actual documentation that there's a guardian in place, but then we can't reach them. And then we're like, okay, so who should be making decisions now? Or we have a patient who's saying one thing and their guardian saying the other, and you start to question, does the patient really lack capacity here? Should I be giving more leeway to the patient than to their guardian? I know. But we have had those situations where it looks like the patient's making fully, appropriate decisions, and they sound very rational in their decision making. And we can't get in touch with the guardian, so should we listen to the patient in that situation? It still comes up, and there's always a question of, who should we be talking to right now? Another thing to also consider is looking at advanced directives, because people don't often deal with them. They often don't know how to handle them. For us, our big issue is just getting access to them when they actually exist, and then actually knowing how to interpret them once you get a copy of them. So just by show of hands, how many of you guys have actually looked at a patient's advanced directive, that a patient has actually come in with their advanced directives?
Not psychiatric, medical.
Medical?
I've
Okay.
seen them.
You've seen them?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've dealt with them a lot. But yeah, a lot of staff members aren't used to seeing them, but if you guys are on the ethics committee, you should be very comfortable with looking at these documents, being able to interpret the documents, and assisting patients with completing them if they're willing to do that. Also looking at life-sustaining treatment, not as relevant to your group here, but it's just something else to consider if you ever have any situations that come close to looking at or dealing with life-sustaining issues. So looking a little bit deeper at the policy of informed consent, you want to consider administration of medications without informed consent, or if you have a situation of informed refusal. ECT. How often do you guys deal with ECT here?
Not very often.
Not very often, okay. But it is something that is dealt specifically in the ORC and is handled differently from many other therapies that you can offer. So you definitely want to be aware of that, and that's one of the reasons why we want to lay it out in policy. Hospitalization without consent. Do you guys have a policy on that yet?
All the time.
Yes, yeah. And then the definition of imminent risk of harm to self and others. This is a big issue of how to actually interpret what imminent risk actually means, because it is definitely up to interpretation. So providing some guidelines around that can be very helpful. Okay. The policy on advanced directives. When you look at that, you want to consider, of course, guardianship, because you guys deal with it so often, and also looking at surrogate decision making. Who can consent to ECT? Who can consent to provision of certain medications? Again, I think depending on the practitioner that you're dealing with, some are okay with a certain class of medications that a surrogate can give consent to, and then for certain other ones, they're not okay with a surrogate giving consent to it. So, just providing some more guidance around that can also be helpful. Okay, turning to ethics consultation, which is the third component of what the committee can be dealing with. So ethics consultation is a function of a committee that directly engages the clinical need that drove the development of the ethics committee in the first place. So I don't know if what brought the committee to restart again was a case. Was it? Or was it just a recognition that you guys need to have a committee?
I think it was the sense that it wasn't very active in terms of the running of our institution,
Okay.
and that was the idea. I think that's right.
Okay. Well, hopefully with the reinvigoration of the committee, you guys will start dealing with more of these issues that do come up.
You'd have thought they'd have considered a younger person for this. Some of it great enthusiasm and energy. In any event.
One thing that you might notice, if you are regularly meeting and you are, and the institution recognize, the practitioners recognize that this is a service, you might see more and more consultations as a reflection of the trust which you've earned from those on the ground. Right? So committees can be defunct and no one knows about them, but all of a sudden if you get one consultation and you handle it very well, and people say, wow, that was really helpful, next time I'll call them again.
Right.
And the word spreads. You might find yourself saying, we have so much business now, this is unmanageable, but nonetheless, you handle one consultation well, it leads to another consultation and another when you're seen as helpful and people can trust you to give good advice.
Or providing education that is directly in line with issues that people are struggling with. That's another way that you generate consults. Okay. So ASBH, the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, is like the parent group for all clinical ethicists. So they define ethics consultation as a service provided by an individual or a group to help patients, families, surrogates, healthcare providers, or other involved parties address uncertainty or conflict regarding value-laden issues that emerge in healthcare. I think you guys already have recognized that these issues definitely come up in this institution. So again, consultation will be part of what we're doing on a regular basis. Okay, next.
So let me just talk a little bit about what it would be like to do a consultation. Because again, I think the point of this is to give you some assistance in getting things running. So if the threefold function of a committee is for education, which I suggested if you're an ad hoc committee, it may be more difficult to gather together to read literature, which is why I might suggest meeting at least quarterly and providing topics for discussion. Policy formation and review, and then ethics consultation. And if you're an ad hoc committee, that's what you've primarily been tasked to do. So how are you going to do this? If someone calls you and says, this is my particular problem I have, right? You want to be ready to think about this, to offer good advice. And what you don't want to do is give some really abstract advice that says, well, the patient has autonomy, so you need to let the patient make the decision for the patient itself and then hang up the phone. Right? How are you going to respond to the call that earns respect and trust from clinicians such that they call you back because your advice was well received and it was helpful, it was perceived as helpful? The way in which you just get started, there's so much to do, but the way in which you just get started is by thinking about principlism.
anyone in here heard of what is sometimes called the Georgetown mantra, the 4 principles of bioethics? One being autonomy is a big concept in bioethics. The other principle being beneficence. The third principle being non-maleficence, right? The do no harm, as the Hippocratic Oath tells you to do, and justice. Each of these principles are going to be applicable in various ways. The challenge for you is to take these extremely broad concepts and understand how they work in a mental health institution such as Heartland. Right? And that's going to be your challenge. When someone says, here's my ethical issue, you need to think to yourself, okay, what principles are applicable here? And what advice could I give such that maybe there's an agreement between all parties, there's mutual agreement, or maybe at least the parties who disagree can understand about why this is ethically appropriate or not. Right? And then the second piece, which I think is important, and again, it's really just the tip of the iceberg here, is patient-clinician relations. And a big sort of the species underneath this big category I think is really important for mental health is confidentiality. I think it's very, very important. So I'm going to touch on some of these, okay? And we can, if you have questions about some other issues, we can talk about them, but let me just move into some ideas in regard to autonomy and confidentiality, such that you have an idea about how these may function in mental health care and how they may arise here at this institution and how you may begin to earn the trust of clinicians here. Okay? All right, so let me just review these again, okay? Most people can rattle these off, although beyond that, most people can't tell you what they mean or how they're applicable. But autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Autonomy. Does anyone have a working definition of what autonomy means? Particularly with respect to medicine, patient care. It's the capacity to choose or decide on the basis of one's hopefully core values and beliefs. Right? When you act autonomously, if you break this down, this word down just etymologically, it means self-regulating or self-governing. Right? It means that you have some principles which you live by. Right? Presumably everyone in here has a principle which you think, in many ways, helps you understand who you are. Right? Autonomous decision-making or autonomous action is acting in accordance with those core principles. We call them values or beliefs as well. Beneficence, right? Trying to promote the well-being of patients. Right? Sometimes you might say, right, what is going to promote the well-being of our patient may not be what the patient is deciding. Maybe the patient has some principles which the patient lives by, which you think are pretty corrupt principles. Right? This patient's a sociopath. The sociopath has principles which the sociopath lives by. Right? It might be, my principle is getting over on everyone I know. Right? I'm going to dupe, deceive, and trick everyone because that's who I am, right? You might say, I'm not going to let my patient act according to those principles, act autonomously, because it's not in the patient's well-being, right? So you might say to yourself, in a case like this, right? Let's say you get a call, and the call is in regard to your antisocial, psychopathic patient, and the clinician says, my patient has been making these terrible decisions. I really think I can help the patient, but the only way in which I can help the patient is if the patient is forced to undergo treatment with me. Help me think about this. One way in which you might help the caller is by saying, well, I see, this is the way in which I see a case like this. I see two principles clashing here. I see autonomy clashing with beneficence. Let's see whether one principle outweighs the other. Okay? These are always going to be balanced. Non-maleficence, thinking about, again, doing no harm, or at least choosing the option which entails least harm. Sometimes you have to hurt patients. Right? But you do it in light of hopefully thinking that you're going to ultimately, in the end, benefit the patient. And then justice, the way in which we understand this in biomedical ethics, is usually with allocation decisions. Again, we talked about the reason why ethics committees arose in the first place. It was with regard to scarce resources, right? Like dialysis machines. We have a lot of people who have renal failure. We have a limited supply of machines who can keep these patients alive. Who gets the machine, who lives, and who dies? Right? These are questions of justice. Okay, let me talk a little bit about this concept of mental health care, to sort of get the ball rolling here. Okay. Again, we talked a little bit about advanced directives. They're completed when patients are capacitated. I suspect that it would be very helpful for patients to be offered advanced directives in-house, right? But only when you think the patient can make decisions on the basis of the patient's core principles or beliefs which aren't influenced or corrupted by the current disease. Advanced directives allow patients to appoint proxy decision makers and to make choices about particular treatments, all to take effect should patients later become incapacitated to make decisions for themselves. The problem which I see, and maybe this may be a problem here as well, is that when you work with guardians usually don't know the patients very well. Is that your experience? When you call the guardian and say, we need you to make a decision, and the patient's here, this is what's going on, can you make a decision? Guardians usually make decisions on a basis of best interests. And it's not usually in light of the patient's values, because the guardian doesn't know them. And the guardian is court appointed or someone who volunteers for guardianship services. The wonderful thing about advanced directives is that they allow patients to choose folks to make decisions for them because those folks know them. This is what I would consent to, right, if I weren't so ill. And maybe if what I can do is follow up, we'll give you these slides to have. I have a working bibliography on the end of this slide that you can have as well to help you with certain literature to work with. But also, I think if you can look online for these psychiatric advanced directives. They're very helpful. Again, they allow patients to say, this is the type of medication I would like, this is the type of medication I wouldn't like, making decisions with regard to ECT and end-of-life decision making. Has anyone heard of this particular case from 1991, I believe, Hargrave versus Vermont? The ruling from this case, it was with regard to a woman who was refusing medications. And specifically, she had an advanced directive, which she presented to her institution, which said that she did not want to accept, I don't know particularly what medication, but particular medications. And the state, particularly, and the institution supported the state in overruling her advanced directive and saying that she needed to take these medications. Right? It was because of this particular ruling that when patients present with advanced directives refusing medications, right, it's likely impermissible to coerce the patient to take them anyway. Have you seen cases in which patients have presented with an advanced directive specifically stating the patient doesn't want medications? Have you ever overruled a patient's advanced directive against medications? As a patient advocate, have you seen this? Okay. There's no federal or, I don't believe, Ohio state law in regard to this, but there's this precedent, which is very powerful. Advanced directives may constitute an ironclad bulwark against future involuntary treatment with medication, except in emergencies, even for incapacitated, committed patients, and even when the alternative is long-term institutional care. What I believe happens in some states, and I believe, if not Vermont, but New Hampshire, I was at a working ethics committee ethics conference back in the fall, and I was in this group where practitioners who were struggling, I believe it was in New Hampshire. Patients can be committed involuntarily, but you can't force them to take medications, even if they don't have an advanced directive. If they just say, no, I don't want medications, but they're incapacitated, you can't give them medications. And so people are just constantly rolling in and out of these institutions because they're so ill and they're at risk to themselves or others, but you can't treat them. So they're committed, they stay for a little bit, then they're discharged. they're committed, they stay for a little bit, and then they're discharged, and it's really frustrating to the practitioners. And we were sitting in this round table trying to brainstorm about how to fix the problem, but it didn't seem like there was a solution unless the laws were to change. Is this a similar issue here?
We are able to get forced medication orders from the court
Okay.
for psychiatric meds only. I don't think they have rule on medical
Mhm.
at all, so.
Every time, and again, these were folks from New Hampshire, I believe, but every time the particular institution would try to appeal to the court, there would be like an American Disabilities advocate who would come in and say, no, 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 like you can't do this, and this is discrimination. So it was very frustrating for these folks up in the Northeast. Thinking again, okay, this is one instance is with respect to advanced directives. Another is with respect to addiction, which is a huge issue in this state right now. Yeah. Okay, how do we understand autonomy and addiction? What is your gut feeling about this? When patients present with an addiction, say an opioid addiction, do you think that patients are making autonomous decisions? Do you think they have the capacity to refuse treatments? Should we be forcing them into treatment?
That addiction runs them for pretty hard sometimes. So you have to be careful though, because they do, with the rights in the law, you have to weigh that with who's in charge of this person right now. Is it the addiction or is it themselves?
What I've noticed working with patients with addictions is that just like the antisocial personality, there's reasoning. People are very rational about how to get drugs. Right? People aren't irrational when it comes to getting what they need. Right? They're very good at planning, right? Making a, if you think, well, look, I need to do all these things today, and one being I need to meet my dealer, you're very good at coordinating your day. Right? So there's reasoning, right? There's also understanding in conjunction with reasoning, right? One presumably has insight into one's, well, the insight can be overridden in various ways. When you say you have a problem, people might say, no, I don't, right? But there's some understanding about what addiction is, right? But the question is, does this person have capacity to refuse, right? To break autonomy down a little bit more, and this is sort of my working understanding of this. There are two components, right? There's one being liberty. You might think of this as sort of negative freedom or negative autonomy. It's independence from controlling influences, whether they be external or internal. So to make autonomous decisions, first of all, you need to be free from external coercion or pressure. And someone can't be forcing you to do this. Right? Likewise, you have to be free from internal influences. Right? And this is highly relevant for this institution. Right? People are usually under the influence of something internally, whether it be a mental illness, right? i.e. in this case addiction. Right? The second component is agency, the capacity for intentional action. And as I'm thinking about this, and as I suggest you do as well, right, I think that those who are addicted to substances such as opioids act with intention. And I think there's agency. It's just on the basis, as I mentioned before, of corrupted principles. Right? As I think we should think about this, right, I think addiction does not typically entail a loss of reasoning, remembrance of complex information, goal setting, orientation to time, place, and personal identity, right? But it does entail a loss of liberty. There is this internal influence, right? One needs to find one's drug, especially when one is suffering from withdrawal symptoms. So here's the implication from this, just think about it. It may be ethically permissible, I think, to force treatment on addicts for the sake of their autonomy. You can call this autonomy regained. And you can also extrapolate this not just from cases of addiction, but also in other cases. Right? When we think about ways in which we, as I mentioned before, coerce people to undergo mental health treatment, we may be justifying the coercion for the sake of, look,
if we treat the patient now in this acute period, the patient may then be able to tell us his or her beliefs, desires, wishes, preferences, right? So for many practitioners that I work with, it's very uncomfortable to tie people down, to put people in rooms, force medications on them. But the way in which we justify this bioethically is by saying, we're going to treat one against one's will for the sake of them, him or her, regaining one's autonomy. And I think this is one way you can think about this in regard to addiction. Right? We're going to coerce the patient into treatment for the sake of regaining one's liberty. Let me pause there and just ask questions, answer questions.
Okay, what kind of treatment are you looking at when you're talking about forcing treatment in people with addictions? Are you talking about medical treatment or treatment for the addictions? I don't, there's a long-acting injectable medication now
Right.
that can be used, but so much of that is the patient's buy-in in the process too.
Right.
So you can't force insight.
Right.
I think this does pose a complex question.
Right. Well, let's speak about the case with long-acting medications. Right? That's a good example because I had that on my mind as well. Right? You can give someone an injection, and some research suggests that people can abstain through the course of I don't know how many weeks, 4 weeks.
Yeah, it's every 4 weeks.
Do you think it's ethically permissible? Imagine you get a call, you're the ethics committee, and you get a call from a clinician saying, the patient that I know would benefit from this injection, and I think that if I give this to my patient will return to follow-ups, will buy into an outpatient treatment program. Right? If I don't give the patient the injection, the patient will likely relapse, the patient won't participate in the outpatient programs. Right? But the patient that I know, let's say the clinician even has worked with this patient in the past and said, I've seen this patient buy into outpatient treatment programs. But of course, like most addicts, the patient fell off the wagon. It's part and parcel of recovery. I think that this would be helpful for the patient, but here's my ethical issue. The patient's saying, I don't want that injection. Do I respect the patient's refusal as an autonomous refusal, or do I give the patient the injection against the patient's will? Let's imagine that you get that question as a committee. And I'm suggesting that this might be helpful as you think about this.
So if I would say, if the patient is withdrawing from drugs at that moment, that is a different scenario. Once the patient, so with a long-acting injection usually comes in once the patient has detoxed from whatever drugs they're using, and typically 8 to 10 days later. By this time, the patient has regained the autonomy to say, okay, I'm well now, I'm not withdrawing anymore, there are no substances in my system, and I refuse to take this. I plan to go out and use it again. How are you supposed to force anything on that patient?
Okay, there's a practical question of how you're going to do this.
No, I'm asking what ethical grounds do we have to still think about it? I want to take it to the ethics committee that I want to force medication now that they are sober and doing well.
You think the patient's going to relapse though? You have an inclination the patient's going to go back out and use?
Yes.
Well, so do you think that this patient though, if you gave the long-acting medications, do you think that this patient would perhaps be able to act in accordance with the patient's values which are independent from the addiction? Let's say this patient, let's fill in some more details. This patient is a father. And this patient says, when the patient isn't addicted, this person says, I want to be a good father. I want to care for my kids. I've heard this story before. Let's say that you would say, look, if I give you this medication, I think that you would be able to act in accordance with those values. You wouldn't be neglecting your children and looking to use with this medication. So I suspect that if I give this to you, it would be in accordance with your more core values, not the values of the addiction, not the corrupted values. So you might say, I'm doing this for the sake of the patient's real autonomy,
not the corrupted character from the addiction.
But the question is that is from your perspective, not from the patient's perspective. You may think that they have this corrupted way of thinking at that moment, and they're not looking out for their best interest. But that's your that's not what the patient thinks.
But that's something you can ask them. You can pose that question to them of what is it that you truly value more? Making decisions that are best for you as who you are and your family, or as someone who has this addiction and would prefer to go out and continue this cycle?
I think that your point is a good one. It's that it's very hard to argue with a first-person insight, right? You presumably are the authority on
Right.
what you value, and it's very difficult from a third-person perspective to say, you are wrong about your insight into who you are, right? So your point is well taken insofar as we assume that you are the authority on who you are, right? My thought about this is that there might be, with certain patients, again, it's always case by case, you have to be very sensitive about this, but there may be cases in which you think, I know this patient, and I know this patient, who the patient is, isn't addict. That's a piece of this patient which I think I can control with the medication. There's this other aspect of the patient which I think is more the authentic patient, who is the father, the caring husband, or someone who values getting back to work. And I think I can help that part of the patient, which I think is who the patient really is. And so I'm saying there might be an argument to be made on ethical grounds to support that part of the patient. But again, your point is well taken. We operate with a principle of charity. When someone says, this is who I am, it's very difficult to say, that's not who you are. Right? I'm the psychiatrist, and I can read your mind, and I know you better than you know you. Right? So you want to be very careful about this, because then it looks like coercion, right? But thinking about this, I think that it may be helpful to, right, if a question like this arises, right, who is the patient really? Who is the patient authentically? Are we going to do things to patients against their expressed wishes because we think that we can help who the patient really is? As a committee, right, it would take some investigation. You might say as a committee to this physician, you don't know this patient very well, right? It's not ethically permissible to give this patient medication because you just met the patient. And it's not you don't have the authority or the insight to tell the patient who the patient really is. But you might also, I don't think it's wholly implausible or impossible to say after an investigation as a committee, it seems like you've been working with this patient for a long time. It seems like after talking with the family as a group discussion, this is who the patient really is. We've gathered some more information, right? We have a history. Maybe it is ethically permissible to give this patient this medication against the patient's expressed wishes.
That's the bioethical issues. I
Yeah.
appreciate the
Yeah.
analysis and the thoughts. Then you have the parallel issue of the legal authority to actually administer something in someone's wishes. I don't know. I don't know that there would be, in Ohio, there would be a basis to do that. I mean, if you went to court, I don't see, I'm not sure that the law would buy those arguments, so to speak, or the position for involuntary administration of injectable meds under those circumstances.
Yeah.
I know that's an additional question.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
it's a real practice.
Yeah. No.
Real practice.
So good ethics always requires checking with
Yeah.
when it comes to practically acting on them. What are we going to actually do? This may be a matter of saying, here's what we think about this. Now, actually acting in accordance with our recommendation may be impossible.
Yeah.
Right? At the very least, so if you're the committee though, and you're thinking about this, right, it might be for you, nonetheless, talking with the clinician and the family to say, this is what we think the right thing to do is, right? Can you get the family support? Can you get more stakeholders involved to say, this is what we think the right thing to do is, right? Now, whether you're actually going to administer this without support from the family, without support from the patient, right? If you're going to tie this person down, who seemingly is able to, right, this person isn't involuntarily committed, but has come to you for some assistance, maybe not. Right? But this is just an example of, I think, the way in which good ethics committees think. Right? Thinking about these concepts from an ethical perspective. Trying to determine whether it's ethically permissible to coerce treatments on the basis of the concept of autonomy. Some really good questions. Okay, so with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about confidentiality, just as a second piece, I think, that's very important for sort of the prerequisites for getting your committee started, right? Beecham and Childress, if you are a committee, you should probably be working with this text. It's the Principles of Biomedical Ethics. It's a very helpful, almost biblical-like text for bioethics. Here's what these two say. Confidentiality could be considered a branch or subset of informational privacy. It prevents redisclosure of information originally disclosed within a confidential relationship. That is, a relationship in which the confider has a reasonable, legitimate expectation that the confidant will not further disclose the information to anyone without the confider's authorization. As late as the 60s, confidentiality meant that a physician would not disclose information obtained from the patient to any other person. But here's the problem. We work in teams. How many people are reading the records? A lot of people, if you look at the footprints, the foot traffic through the EMRs. The challenge for modern day practitioners is how do you keep confidentiality when everyone is an expert in one little part of the patient? Do you have psychotherapists at this institution working with patients? On a fundamental level, confidentiality is perhaps the principle which makes this whole thing run. The therapist says, you must promise to tell me everything that is on your mind. No matter how embarrassing or seemingly irrelevant, I will promise to keep strict confidentiality. Without the promise of confidentiality, a fundamental rule to disclose patient information for the sake of treatment won't work. Right? Now, there are a lot of reasons, though, why you might feel like you have to break confidentiality. And again, think of yourself as the committee who's getting a call saying, perhaps the caller says, look, I'm not going to tell you the identifying information of my patient, but I'd like to talk with you about this. Right? Help me understand whether I need to break confidentiality for my patient. Right? It might be with regard to child abuse. Right? Maybe there's a psychotherapist here who is talking with a patient who's saying to his psychotherapist things which he or she has done at home. And the psychotherapist calls you as a committee and says, my patient told me this on the assumption that I wouldn't tell anyone. But this seems real. It seems like it's ongoing, right? Or maybe it happened 15 years ago. The patient doesn't really seem to have changed, but I don't know. What should I do? Testifying in divorce proceedings or child custody hearings. Right? Participating in disability determinations. Assuming legal liability, and disclosing information to third-party representatives like insurance companies. And then, let's not forget, we're all human, and we have a tendency to gossip. All right. Let me review a couple cases, seminal court cases, just for the sake of understanding the importance of confidentiality. Right? You may have remembered this case. It happened in the 60s. There was a student at UC Berkeley who fell in love with Tatiana Tarasov. This particular patient was seeing a psychotherapist at the campus at the University of California. Right? He was mentally deteriorating. He began to threaten violence against Tatiana to his psychotherapist, who was Dr. Moore. Moore breached confidentiality. He warned the Berkeley campus police, who picked Cruzen up for questioning and released him a few hours later. Moore began feeling like an outcast by his colleagues, right? But on October 27th, Cruzen went to Tanya's home, shot her, and fatally stabbed her. There were two rulings, but the one that's most important for us is the second one, Tarasoff 2. In 1976, the court revisited the case, nullified its earlier decision, and decided that a psychotherapist has a legal duty to do something to protect, but not necessarily to warn, an intended victim of a dangerous patient. There are benefits and risks to this. Right? As a famous psychiatrist, Thomas Saz, noted, right, this is the chickens coming home to roost. The claim that psychiatrists possess special knowledge and skills concerning the diagnosis and prediction of dangerousness continues to undergird the psychiatrist's power to commit. The Tarasoff decision extends this classic rationale and duty from the mental hospital to any professional relationship between therapist and patient. In Judge Clark's opinion, he said, given the importance of confidentiality to the practice of psychiatry, it becomes clear the duty to warn imposed by the majority will cripple the use and effectiveness of psychiatry. Many people, potentially violent yet susceptible to treatment, will be deterred from seeking it. Those seeking will be inhibited from making revelations necessary to effective treatment, and forcing the psychiatrist to violate the patient's trust will destroy the interpersonal relationship by which treatment is effective. Okay? So this is a seminal California case, right? It's not a federal case, but nonetheless, each of the states have adopted various regulations about the duty to warn or report. Ohio is such a state, right? So, as a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, right, if someone tells you, your patient, that the patient, say, has abused children or is abusing children, you have an obligation to report. But here's the ethical dilemma. Especially if someone hasn't, say, abused someone in 15 years, but is saying, look, this is part and parcel of, probably why I'm seeing you. Let's imagine the person says, look, this is a problem, and I'm here to work on this. What will happen if you report? You're probably going to lose the patient. The patient's going to be lost to follow-up. Right? The patient will lose trust, maybe in the system itself, and perhaps others who could come forward and seek help will not, for fear of legal action. And so, again, thinking about as a committee, right, there is a process in Ohio. I don't know if anyone's ever looked at these regulations. They're quite extensive. The process to report. Right? What's important to note about this is that in Ohio, if someone tells you that someone is either going to hurt someone else, hurt oneself, it's not your obligation, your legal obligation, to pick up the phone and call Child and Family Services, to pick up the phone and call your local police department. Right? There is a process that you work under, and some of it has to do just with reporting it to your own institution, keeping it in-house, talking about it with your supervisor, with other staff at the hospital to determine what is the best course of action. Right? So imagine, you're an ethics committee, you get a call from one of the practitioners here who says, I don't want to identify my patient, but I am secretly seeing a patient who is threatening to harm someone else. And what should I do? Do I call the local police authorities? At the very least, I recommend to you as a committee to think this through, not to recommend, oh my gosh, you have to pick up the phone and call. Think about things like, when was the last time this person hurt someone? What is your understanding about the person? Has the person planned this precisely to the detail? Is someone just fantasizing about this? Right? Do you think if you continue to work with the patient will just continue to talk about it and not act on it? Right? All that being said, and again, it's case by case, but the ethical thing to do, the right thing to do, may not to be to pick up the phone and call Child and Family Services at that instant, but to think it through with the provider.
Have you guys had experiences with this type of situation before?
And Ohio law is pretty specific on this issue, and it's something that happened. We have a huge forensic, about 70%, I think, of our patients are forensically committed. So I think that there are some significant number of times that this comes up. In any event, the statutory scheme in Ohio is real, I think, very specific. So I think that from that point of view, medical staff are pretty versed in details of this. But as the ethics committee, it certainly brings up a lot of issues too, but it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I think that this, though, goes to the ones that aren't necessarily covered specifically by
Yeah.
the law, because the law can never cover everything. But this is just to illustrate, there are ones that fall in between that you guys would need to take a little bit more time considering before you pick up that phone.
But I guess in some respects, I think that many of the things, and we do a lot of forced order, I mean, court order stuff, so that in a sense, addresses many of the very important issues you're talking about in terms of informed consent and the courts have already, told us what to do. But so in some respects, the brief answer to your question is, I think we often run into this issue, and when we do, that's the statutory, the law tells us pretty specifically what must be done. But the bioethical issues, of course, are additional and important issues to consider.
On the other side of the coin, I had received a call in my capacity as clinical services director. A therapist in the community called me. Her client was present, and her client was stating about someone who was in our hospital and making the statement, I don't know what I would do if I saw her in the community, I might hurt her. So that was a situation of she was doing the duty to warn or informed consent, even though there wasn't a specific threat, but she was doing it in collaboration with the patient.
Exactly, yeah.
So that was kind of a unique situation where the threat was coming in as opposed to our folks threatening somebody on the outside.
Well, that doesn't mean legal action will be taken if you warn. It just means we have an obligation to put people on notice that, A, somebody who has an underlying, this person that has an illness has just brought you up, and give them the opportunity to be aware of that. Doesn't mean we have to contact the sheriff's office or anything like that. It just means we have an obligation to that person to make sure that they're aware.
Well, not necessarily. Like, you can consider that one option is contacting the person who the specific threat's been made to, but you can also consider, are there other ways to avoid the situation from happening as well, such as, continuing treatment, having further discussion with the patient about what issues they have with that specific person, seeing if there are other resources that may be available to help that specific person avoid having a conflict or having an issue with the person that they've threatened.
Yeah, and that's ongoing, that's kind of a given when they're here. If they're expressing this, that obviously people are going to be trying to work with them at the same time. The thing with our population here is they've already shown a propensity to violence.
Okay.
And usually when they come in because they're unsafe, either with themselves or somebody else. So it's very, very rare that we get somebody who's just here just because,
So the bar's already set a little bit.
The bar's already set. They've already met the criteria for emergency hospitalization or forensic hospitalization because a crime was committed in a violent nature. So that kind of ups our ante a little bit, where, hey, this person's shown a propensity to violence, and we have to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to make sure that, if that's on their mind, we have to make sure we are doing what we're expected to do according to the law, according to the rights and ethics of protecting another person.
One way in which, as I've thought about this, again, I think that, as Dr. Christie mentioned, I'm a candidate at the Psychoanalytic Center in Cleveland, and so I've been thinking a lot about, just in the context of psychoanalysis, you're supposed to say whatever comes to your mind. And there's a question of saying whatever comes to your mind, whether that entails also giving a Miranda warning, saying, please say whatever comes to your mind, but just so you know, if you tell me X, Y, or Z, I need to call the police. Right? It undermines the very fundamental principle of the therapy. And so one thing, at the very least, what I've been thinking about in light of all of this, is that just being honest with patients as a part of almost the initial interview. Right? Even if you're here because you've been
required to by a court, right? When we talk together, you should have confidence in me that what you say to me is between us. However, there are exceptions. This is not, if patients understand, this is not attorney-client privilege. Right? This is not something which, right, if I hear something which is a threat to another or you, right, I may be required to talk to others about this. And you may say, my first stop would be the ethics committee, just as a mechanism for discussing the appropriate actions. And so patients just know. Right? And it may, the consequence may be the patient says, well, hell, I'm not going to tell him this. We might not get that information, and that might be a sacrifice that you have to make.
Well, I get a lot of information as the advocate.
Okay.
Because they see me as an ally, they don't see me as another clinician who's evaluating what they say. But they know, and I've told them, I'm like, they'll usually ask, hey, can I talk to you in confidence? And I'm like, yeah, and the only thing, I'm just gonna let you know, I mean, I'm here to listen to you and be a supporter for you, but if you threaten to hurt yourself or somebody else, I have the obligation to make sure that I let people know, okay? And they're usually good with that, and then I hear all kinds of stuff, you know, but I think it's our responsibility to make sure that they're aware of that. You know, and then when there's been times where somebody's really been really sick and expressing delusional stuff, I do let the teams know, because I think they just need to look at them. I don't have to go into specifics on what they said, but just go in and let them know that, hey, this person came to see me, it looks like they're compensating, they're really expressing some stuff. So, I mean, there's that.
Yeah.
There's kind of a given, because we're a team, we work together.
Right.
But I don't have to divulge everything they said to me either, you know.
Well, this is a good segue into this case. Has everyone heard the Jaffe-Redmond case from the early 90s? So Karen Beyer was a clinical social worker in Chicago, and she particularly was treating Officer Redmond, who had shot a member of the Jaffe family. To condense an interesting story, this officer responded to a dispatcher's report of a fight in progress at these estates in a suburb of Chicago. Officer Redmond fired her gun at Ricky Allen Sr. and killed him. And after the shooting, Officer Redmond sought counseling from Karen Beyer. And she was in therapy for 2 to 3 times a week until January of '92. So almost 6 months or so. During the pretrial discovery, the plaintiffs learned that Redmond sought counseling and subpoenaed Beyer to testify and to produce her credentials, notes, records, and reports pertaining to Redmond. Ms. Beyer refused to break confidentiality through multiple depositions, only stating the officer's factual description of events leading up to the shooting. The jury returns a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs. Right? So the first, by the Seventh Circuit Court, the first decision, there was a privilege that was recognized. However, right, a nature requires an assessment of whether in the interest of justice, the evidentiary need for the disclosure of the contents of a patient's counseling sessions outweigh patient privacy. It then went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then created, in their ruling, a new absolute privilege for the psychotherapist patient, analogous to the lawyer-client privilege. And they cited another one of their opinions. The Supreme Court also decided to apply the new privilege to social workers.
So basically, the Supreme Court overruled the initial court ruling for this, from the Seventh Circuit Court.
Which means that this is particularly important for psychotherapy notes, right? That if you are required to testify, right, and you think that, right, you have the patient's best interest in mind, you are not required to disclose your psychotherapy notes. This is the privilege is as ironclad as the lawyer-client privilege.
And it's enshrined in now a federal Supreme Court case, so it applies everywhere.
Yeah. So again, thinking about yourselves as a committee. Let's say that someone calls you as a committee and says, I've been asked to testify, right, to disclose the contents of my work with this patient. What should I do? Right? Think about this ruling, right? Think about the Jaffe-Redmond case. Right? This privilege between the psychotherapist and the patient is as ironclad as the attorney-client privilege. Right? You are not required to testify and disclose those notes.
That's interesting, because the forensic the forensics, when they go to continued commitment or, level increase to more independence in the community, they do testify. Because that's part of how they're doing is, in the testimony of these doctors, really does determine their placement in the community or not, continued hospitalization.
Is it as a role as a psychotherapist though? No.
So
So
the
you-
therapist it
You
would.
disclose
Sure, I
to the
mean,
patient right from the beginning that whatever they say is not confidential.
Yeah.
So that is something that you have to start your work with the patient with. So since they already know it, then you can do it. But let me ask you this, so psychotherapy could be a loose term also. As a psychiatrist, I may see a patient and provide some psychotherapy also. Would that mean that I do not have to disclose that, or?
Right, as a if you argue that this was psychotherapy and you have, say, process notes, right? Those process notes do not have to be given to the courts as evidence, right? That is something which you have a right to withhold.
I think that the key thing in thinking about these types of situations is that, are we dealing with a criminal court case, where a situation where...
Yeah, that's different.
Yeah, that's different than versus, this is a determination of what should actually happen with the patient in front of you, where your notes may be relevant. You do have the option of not choosing, or choosing to not provide your notes in those type of situations. You have that flexibility.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction to make. Again, given that the vast majority of our patients are committed involuntarily through the court, and, are here for, in some instances, years and years and years. So, I mean, that kind of stuff is different than the civilly committed person, perhaps, or voluntary. We do have some voluntary folks, but they're in the small minority.
Okay. That all being said, I chose autonomy and confidentiality because I think that they're important in the setting of mental health. Again, I've said multiple times, this is the tip of the iceberg as an ethics committee about what you want to be thinking about. We only have a couple more minutes. We thought that we would talk about some cases, but 5 minutes is not a lot of time. So maybe as a decision, would you like to spend the rest of the time just talking about some of the things that we've talked about and ask questions and whether it be the nuts and bolts of getting the committee running again, a function, role, or...
Well, I mean, I'll speak as a committee member. The presentation has been terrifically helpful and informative. I'm sure I can speak for all of the members of the committee itself, helping us to get our thoughts together, first about organization, secondly about role and function, and then thirdly, the ideas of principle and ideas of, and by the way, this is a minor point, but I don't know why, it looked to me like principalism was misspelled when I first saw that. So I looked, and that's the way it's spelled. I was wrong. But I'm not a very good speller.
You might think it would be principalism, but yeah, it's principalism.
There was something missing here, but I digress, as they say. But it's been a great help, I think, for me and for the other folks. The concept of abstracting things in terms of, and then focusing on these bioethical issues and case consultation and, because there's so many other issues involved, of course, we have to consider.
Yeah.
But as our role, as to how, principally, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And you've given us many the theoretical and practical suggestions and information that's going to be helpful. And I guess you have a bibliography up there.
Yeah, so, when you're doing case consultations, and this is an enormously helpful little text that you can use to describe what it's like to facilitate an ethics consultation. I highly recommend, again, this Principles of Biomedical Ethics as a starter for understanding these things more or less from an academic perspective, but also I was looking at, where is it? This text yesterday, Applied Ethics in Mental Health Care, that was published just in 2013 by MIT Press. This has wonderful sections on some of the things we touched on today, being autonomy and addiction, personality disorders and decision-making. It has a whole section on forensic psychiatry, which sounds like everyone here could probably spend like multiple sessions thinking about the ethics of forensic psychiatry at this institution. So immensely, there's so much helpful resources out there that you can use as a committee to say, we need to meet regularly, whether it be 3 times a year at least, and we need topics for discussion and distributing literature and saying, this is going to have to be our starting point because when we get a call, we want to be helpful, right? Again, if you are, I've struggled with this myself as an academic, someone who came from academia, to say, when you provide abstract advice, it's not helpful, right? People want to know, what do I do? Tell me what to do. You know, you want to say this is why it's the right thing to do, right? You don't just want to be a general and tell people to do something, right? But you need some of these concepts as the foundation for your reasoning. This is the right thing to do, and this is why. Right? So some of these texts are going to help you think about why, the principles of biomedical ethics, and then thinking about it in terms of, at this institution, applied ethics in mental health care, for instance. The American Psychiatric Association has a whole book on a clinical guide to psychiatric ethics that was published just 2 years ago by Weiss Roberts. It's just a lot of stuff to help you as a committee, again, thinking about policy development and education and consultation.
Anybody else, any thoughts?
What I've experienced here as a police chief in the last few years is that occasionally, generally like some clinical care person or social worker would contact me in reference to patients that they have concern with that are being released and they have weapons. So the discovery thereof, they have concerns of releasing the patient to, a community mental health facility, halfway house, or back out into the residence. And they fear that they have weapons, the patients disclose that information, and they would like to have those weapons taken for safekeeping. So in that, I've always referred them back, of course, to the treatment team and the attending doctor, because I said, as of now, unless they're adjudicated by the system and formalized under law, I can't help you with that. I mean, just because we're discharging a patient and you have an insecurity or a concern, it doesn't become a law enforcement issue because we can only follow it if they're adjudicated delinquent, mentally ill. So I've kind of always done that, and then the process, which is interesting, I've always shared the hyperlink for those 2 laws for Ohio back to that person inquiring with me. That's happened about 4 or 5 times since I've been here. So I've kind of even shared and educated my officers on those duty to protect laws, because when officers, are doing their patrols of the units, at times they're communicating with those patients as just kind of a community-oriented mechanism. And the patients end up disclosing things to them, which concern officers, because right away when a patient starts saying, oh, well, I know who did this, this, and this, or so-and-so is doing that, that, and that, I always have a standard in the department. They refer that information back to the charge nurse, nurse manager, attending doctor, or treatment team member to manage that. Am I doing the right thing? Well, I'm only asking because we have a tendency that, well, let's call law enforcement, and being we have our own police department, they refer a lot of that to me. And of course, we only have jurisdiction within this facility on this campus, so.
Right.
That is a function of the treatment team to an extent that if, for instance, we know that someone was here because they were suicidal or homicidal, there's no legal charges against them, and they have a rope or a gun in their possession, we have a training on reduction of access to legal means. And so typically would be the social worker that would end up contacting someone in the community, whether that's a family member or someone that person might identify, because you work with the individual as much as possible and find someone that you can identify with the assistance of the local law enforcement where the person resides to perhaps go to their place with the patient's permission and get the gun. I mean, there's a variety of different ways that it gets handled, but it's usually
Do we have to be cautious on how you share that? I mean, a consent of a patient is no different than a consent of a citizen to an officer. I want to search your house. Would you sign the consent form? You have the right to refuse at any time. I walk into the house, halfway in the house, and go, sir, stop the search. I don't want to give you consent any longer. Unless I don't have probable cause, I have to leave the residence and seek a warrant if I have cause. So what I'm asking, if they disclose it, it's a consent decree or a consent notice, so be it. But where does it, I'm very legalistic, so where does it go from a concern, I'm going to call the family member, or I'm going to call the local law enforcement to go to their house to try to find out some way of taking that firearm or that knife or that rope or whatever that.
So is your question in regard to confidentiality, that someone has told you something and you don't know whether you should be calling the healthcare provider back and informing of this information, or?
Well, it's in-house. I'm not saying outside in. This is internally here in our facility. So under the duty to protect, the privacy confidentiality clauses are all very defined, like Dr. Christie mentioned. They're very articulated well, I think, that navigates who's responsible, what they have to do. I mean, it even says that if the medical director reviews the case and has concern, he brings an independent risk psychiatrist in. That has to be done within a few days, actually. Then they meet again and send it out to law enforcement if it rises to that level of concern of a crime being alleged to be committed by that patient.
I mean, in my understanding what I'm hearing, I think that the appropriate mechanism is to bring it back to the institution through the process that's listed. I actually, in my reading of that process, which is very lengthy, but again, I like it because it's not, you need to pick up the phone immediately and call an independent enforcement institution. Right? There are steps to make sure that you're doing the right thing, and those steps are calling your immediate supervisor and saying, or getting a consultation, right? If you're an independent practitioner, just saying, I need a consultation because I'm seeing a patient right now that is concerning to me.
Or even before that step, having discussion with the patient, because I actually have dealt with a similar situation of a patient. Well, actually, she was a patient. She was visiting her father, and she had actually brought weapons to the institution, and also had weapons in the home as well. And it was recognized that she was a danger to herself and others, and she made threats while visiting her dad. So she actually ended up becoming a patient of ours, going to an inpatient psych facility on our campus. And so in that situation, we did go down and speak to our law enforcement folks, but that was because she had brought the weapon to our institution to search her vehicle. And then we, with discussion with her, we actually encouraged her to speak with other family members because we were concerned about her safety, and asked the other family members to also confiscate those weapons and put them in a safe area as well. And also kind of kept her, when she became a patient of ours, kept her clinical team kind of abreast of what was happening to make sure that she remained safe and no one else was in danger.
So a segue question to what you were saying. So when does it come, or when does it transfer to them being formally adjudicated that they're not permitted to have weapons?
So,
Like that's a perfect case, in my opinion, that would be conveyed back to a court system to decide, hey, we've deemed them, not fit, so to speak, or they're, adjudicated.
so one of the things for our campus is that whenever you come onto our campus, you're not allowed to bring weapons. And it's, I don't know how well known it is that you're not allowed to bring those weapons, but it's very clear that that's not something that is appropriate in a hospital setting. And our law enforcement, they very much are aware that that sometimes does happen. And in that situation, the patient did specifically say to us that if her father died while he was in our care, that she was going to shoot certain members of our team. So there was a very specific threat. And then in addition to her disclosing the fact that she actually had a weapon in her car. So that definitely ratcheted things up. That prompted us to go to our own law enforcement officers to let them know about the situation and what the next steps would be. No charges were formally ever brought against her, but they, like I said, they confiscated her weapon and banned her from campus until she went into our inpatient psych facility.
So this is an interesting thing you bring up. Sorry, I'm going to mention something else. I'm kind of tagging this. This is where the Department of Justice is doing a study now because of all the recent active aggressor shootings in schools and other areas, and they're trying to link it back to our expertise and finding out that there are prior admissions in psych hospitals or confined facilities for mental health care and whatnot. So this is what a concern for me as a long-term law enforcement officer is that I see that working the streets for 20 years prior to coming here, that there's a perfect example that if you don't criminally charge them, pushing it back into the court forum to identify them to be delinquent, if they're going to carry on with that firearm and eventually, potentially, I mean, I know the percentages are anywhere from 30 to 70% in the communities of them doing harm. There's the void that I think the Department of Justice is studying the last couple of years of going, what are we missing and not knowing that's actually we're finding after the event that they've been treated in these facilities and have had committed crimes that would rose to the level of them being delinquent. When professional law enforcement and healthcare facilities would have known, you're not permitted to have that. You know what I'm saying? Maybe it's a question.
They're put on notice is in the mission packet upon admission that BCII, if they're involuntarily committed at any time, even under forensic status, they no longer are able to obtain firearms legally. And that won't stop anybody from buying them off the streets because they're criminals, you know. But upon discharge, we've had a few that were violated because they had weapons under disability after this had happened, and they had a status of involuntary commitment, and there's no way to stop them from getting them. You can tell them legally they cannot have them, but I think we do our due diligence to make sure that the law is followed. But at the end of the day, if they're going to get them, how do we prevent them from buying them off the black market?
Yeah, I think we're going down that road that we're never going to stop the behavior or the access.
Yeah.
I'm not that. I'm
Like
talking
legally
about
you can-
keeping that continuity of legal information and psychiatric
Sharing
information,
the
sharing.
information.
Right, kind of like goes back to what my original question was about duty to protect.
So
Responsible sharing.
unfortunately, the laws that currently exist, both federal and state, they're very clear about when we can violate the confidentiality of patients and how we go about appropriately sharing the information between legal authorities and healthcare providers. So it has to be very specific to the sort of situation that you're dealing with before you can determine whether or not it is okay for you to disclose that to a law authority.
Yeah, and I agree with Dr. Christie. The law is very defined. Ohio did a really nice job, like literally giving you a perfect flow chart to follow. I mean, it's actually well written, very simple to follow, but yeah, so.
Often statutes are very simple, easy to read.
Well, for me,
No, I'm kidding. Usually they're contorted.
Oh,
That's
that's
a paragraph and
They're ambiguous at
paragraph.
right.
But that law is, I don't know who drafted it, that law was well drafted. And I couldn't agree more. It gives us a very specific, these are, because it's such important issues, so it makes it very clear, so. But I do want to thank you guys for what I consider to be a wonderful and helpful presentation. And we can't thank you enough. That's really, I think, exceeded our expectations, if that's even possible. So thanks so much. And I don't want to tie up your time. I know you've been very generous with us about that.
Well, I'm always happy to continue to answer any questions you have as the committee gets up and running and you have some questions about anything.
I appreciate that. If that's the case,